on this wonderful 19th of May. Well, in New Zealand it is anyway, on this very crisp New Zealand wintry morning. I have with me a wonderful guest, Mr. Steve Seven, all the way from Germany, expat Kiwi author, and I would say a modern mystic in a sense too. But I'm going to let Steve, come in and introduce himself a little bit, talk a bit about his background, and then we're going to get the conversation rolling. So I'm going to bring Steve into the stream now. So here we go. All right, Steve, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Phil.
Oh, brilliant. Well, thank you, brother, so much for joining me today. And it's a real pleasure and a delight for me to have you here. And, I read your recent publication, the Spiritual Alchemy manual, and I'm looking forward to reading it again, actually, because it was so good. Like I want to go back and get a bit more in there, get my teeth into it. But what I'd love you to do is if you can just give a little bit of a background of where you've come from and what sort of brought you to this, creating this information, and just go for it, my bro.
Okay, well, thanks for having me on the show, Phil. As you said, I'm from New Zealand. I'm living in Germany at the moment. I came here 10 years ago to further my studies in psychology, depth psychology, and philosophy, because most of the work that I'm reading, the modern work that I'm reading, was written in Germany, but in German, and very often there's some bad translations. So in a way, because for me, psychology, depth psychology, Jungian archetypes, and these concepts are very much tied into the way that I read alchemy. It was an important thing for me to do that, to come here. I don't consider myself expat New Zealand. Probably, I don't know how I'd see myself in the form of national sort of pride or anything like that. I just sort of see myself as part of the world, global culture.
Yeah, no, fair enough.
I guess the easiest way for me to explain how I got into spiritual alchemy was effectively I spent, I suppose it would have been the best part of 20 years searching for a good path that suited my own spirituality, and the more that I just sort of, it's like Dr. Seuss says in The Cat in the Hat Comes Back, the best way to find something is to sort of look where it isn't, and then you can be crossing off each of the places where this thing can't be found. And I just sort of went through the labyrinth of the various different faiths and traditions and ended up at alchemy, which through Carl Jung, because it ties in very much with the focus that I have, which is understanding the psychology of spiritual experience. And it's also very much a healing process. The concept of turning lead into gold and the alchemical cauldron is more to do with facing your own repressions and childhood pain and these sort of aspects of your shadow, and then dealing with them in an honest way for self-awareness, which brings eventually self-realization. So these are the things that I had always wanted to understand and master, and then through my contact with reading Carl Jung and other alchemy, and also my contact with the Hermetic tradition in general, alchemy being part of the Western Hermetic tradition, I just naturally sort of gravitated to the art of alchemy.
Yeah, it's funny because I find myself in a similar position. I was raised a Christian, and I've been to various churches when I was a young person, and I sort of, I didn't, I enjoyed the idea of spirituality, but I didn't really find it to be, I don't know. Maybe I'm still wondering about it. But when I a few years back I had a crisis in my life, and that got me on a road to exploration. And then I started having some experiences that I struggled to sort of like reconcile with the information that was sort of readily available through mainstream. And I started exploring dreams, and then I came across the tarot and Kabbalah, and then the concept of archetypes came up, and that's such a fascinating conversation for me, because it helped me to start, and just to segue, but just to tack something else on, I should say, is that what you were talking about, you mentioned something that I would say is akin to, say, the apophatic sort of learning process, which is where you work through what something is not, like you're separating what something is, or what is not, and so that helps you to easier find what something is. I mean, it doesn't necessarily take you straight to it, but it cuts away a lot of the fat, and that kind of thinking modality has been so helpful to me, because it's like, even before I sort of woke up, and in a sense, if I can call it that, and started researching these things, I would often say that I don't necessarily know what I want in life, but I certainly have a much better understanding of what I do not want in my life.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
you know. So yeah,
absolutely.
please go for it.
Yeah, well, you talk about the experiences that you've had, and often you can't reconcile. I think when I was 19, I had my first very profound spiritual experience. Well, certainly as an adult, anyway, a conscious. I often talk about having conscious adult experience at 19, because when I was a child, I used to have a lot of what you'd call mystical experiences, astral traveling, and things like this,
Mm.
and seeing visions and other things. And then when I was 19, and I'd sort of forgotten about that during my teens until I was 19. And then hand in hand, in fact, with a few of my friends on Hokianga Harbour in
Oh,
Northland, New Zealand. Yeah, I was living an alternative lifestyle, and anyway, to cut a long story short, one of my friends had sort of got a message, sort of a divine message that he was sent to teach, and I was the first person that came along. He was a fallen Christian and had gone back to the Bible, and I was the first person that came along and listened to him talking about God and spirituality. And at that point, I'd already seen that there was what I considered at the time to be a sort of a guidance over my life. So I was ready to listen to someone talking to me about God and spirituality. And as it happened in this particular context, he was a fundamentalist Christian, so-called Bible-believing Christian. And so the package that I first was delivered, my first sort of adult spiritual experience, happened to be fundamentalist Christianity wrapped in with it. But having said that, despite all of the problems that are concomitant with fundamentalist Christianity, which we don't need to go into, but I had a real experience. I felt what Romain Rolland would call the Oceanic Feeling. I felt that I'd been lifted up out of my body. I could feel for want of a better word, my aura floating out, and the love in my heart, which was the center of my aura, or this energy field, and as I was talking to people, I could feel this love enveloping them. If they didn't understand or they didn't agree with me, I could feel that it was being cut off, the energy was being cut off. If they did understand, then it would grow bigger, and these sorts of things were hand in hand with this first experience. And it took me many years, in fact, to isolate the experience itself from the context of fundamentalist Christianity, and through understanding about archetypes and constellated archetypes and depth psychology, I was able to have a more rational understanding of a mechanical process that we have that gives us some of these so-called religious experiences or spiritual experiences, which are deep healing, spontaneous healing processes, often cathartic healing processes that our soul will lead us through on the journey, if you like, the hero's journey of self-awareness and the healing. And I think that for a lot of people, this is the point. This is what brought me to this big long sort of tangent, if you like, was you saying, you know, having these experiences without understanding them. When I first had this experience at 19 years old, I thought I had become a born-again Christian. I'd accepted Jesus as my savior, and then I had the Holy Spirit enter me, as is the rhetoric of the church. But in fact, that's not what happened. What happened was, now looking back with further hindsight and retrospect, to be able to understand, you know, more rationally, what happened was that I accepted the archetype of my higher self. I accepted that I was more than just a material human person who had been abused and ridiculed by his family and had a, you know, huge inferiority complex and all of these things. I actually accepted that I was a child of God, consciously, and that constellated the archetype of the higher self, which brought a whole lot of unconscious energy with it as an archetype. The archetypes are beyond our personal subconscious mind. They are an inherited aspect of our mind, if you like. So the archetypes are bigger than us. Right? They're bigger than our consciousness. And what I did consciously was attach myself to the archetype of my higher self, which came up, brought a whole lot of subconscious, my own personal subconscious with it for healing. Yeah, it gave me some emotional catharsis for a period of 6 weeks or so that I needed at the time. Unfortunately, what happened is that I didn't understand that process at the time, and therefore I was not able to continue with it. And it took me the best part of 10 years of studying and being involved in various different disciplines to actually work out what had happened and then be able to continue with the processes. And again, we come back to spiritual alchemy, and that's in fact part of the whole package of spiritual alchemy as a discipline, is to go through the cathartic processes and to heal the personal subconscious, so that a clear path is given for the fuller and purer constellation of the higher self, which is the archetype that is in the collective unconscious, what Jung called the collective unconscious. And all that term means is that it's a psychic bedrock that we're all born with, that's common to all people. It includes instincts and it includes archetypes, which are common for everyone. It's the universal, that's all it means. And there's nothing controversial about the concept of the collective unconscious. It's something that all neurologists and all psychologists would agree that humans have a particular level of instinctual mind or inherited mind that we're born with. And because it's inherited, because it's hundreds of thousands of years old, it's bigger than us. And when an archetype comes forward, like I call them spiritual instincts, when it comes up, it's constellated to the surface, it has an energy that is also bigger than our conscious mind.
Yeah, and you know, this is the thing too, is this you know, this thing about having direct personal experience, as opposed to sort of hearing about it sort of secondhand. You know, I didn't want to believe, man. You know, I want to know, and so you know, I didn't just want to sign up with something and go, well, you know, obviously everyone else is into it, or this must be the thing. You know, it brought into question a lot of what I knew, and you know, I had to go explore. And for me, one of the best examples I use is that I went on an early on in this situation. I was sort of floundering around, wondering what to do. I got burnt out in my teaching business, and I was just sort of wandering around, trying to figure out what the heck to do. And I went to a conference. I met some people. I had some very, very strange synchronistic and synchromistic experiences with a lady who was running a conference in Taupo. I went to see an author and speaker, Dr. Bruce Lipton. He was giving a very small, speech to a very small group, and he was quite key in my early sort of awakening, I guess, seeing him on various consciousness documentaries that I saw early on when I was starting to wake up. But I met the lady who was running the conference, turned out to be the ballet teacher of my uncle in the 50s. And I mean, what's the chances of that, right? And then,
yeah, that's right.
That's right. And then the guy, there was a young Austrian dude there. He's on my friends list, and he was quite interesting, and he exposed me to, we had an experience there where my friend met us at the conference. She paid for my ticket. I was completely broke, and she shouted me a ticket. She came up from Wellington. I came down from Auckland to Taupo. And after the Bruce Lipton speak, everyone was pretty held back. It was a 6-hour speech squashed down to about 3 hours. And she had a migraine, and the guy put his hands on her head, and the next thing, the migraine's gone. And everyone's like, hey, how did that happen? That got me interested in energy healing. I needed to see some evidence for this myself. And so I went back home, read a bunch of books on it, practiced it on some people, and it worked. The first time, the second time, the third time. If it didn't work the first few times at all, I wouldn't have carried on with it. And so, I need something solid, practical, and rational, because that's where I've come from. I'm a practical, rational person, and I'm not ready to exclude spirituality just because, the scientific model doesn't necessarily include it. Well, not in the mainstream academic sense anyway. And so I'm very much open to it, and, trying to bridge the gap between spirituality and science. I think that gray area in the middle is becoming a little less foggy, because we are, entertaining ideas now, and people are a lot more open-minded. But the idea of I guess I could class myself as a Western thinker, because I've been brought up in a Western sort of frame of reference with the education system, and 1 and 1 equals 2 and all that. But this need for things to make sense to me, I can't just let things, it's like surrender versus like being able to put things on an abacus or something, and visually see them and be able to rationalize and pigeonhole and all this sort of thing. And I think that's why what you're talking about here is really appealing, and people who are watching this might take a curiosity in this, because they're looking for something. They haven't found something that that they naturally gravitate towards. They've gone for things that are quite openly, publicly, readily available, but they haven't really kind of hit the spot or opened up their curiosity and stimulated their imaginations to encourage sort of further investigation.
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree with everything you said. I mean, I don't believe in anything. I mean, there's a very famous interview of Jung when he was quite old. I think it's actually only about, it was about 1960 or something, and I think he died in 1962, if I remember rightly. So it's just before he died. And they asked him if he believed in God, and he said, well, I mean, if you believe in something, you sort of, you have to kind of try and justify it with different opinions like that. Whereas I go by evidence, and I either know something or I don't know. And he said, I know that God exists. And I guess in a way I'm the same. I was an atheist all the way through my teens. I had no idea what was going to happen, the day that I sat down in the Hokianga and just sort of said, I believe in God. I had no idea that there would be such an experience waiting to happen to me. And it's like I probably wouldn't have carried on as a believer if it hadn't have happened. Of course, my understanding of what God means has changed a great deal over the years. And certainly I don't see, a human-looking figure sitting in the clouds or anything like that. I'm not sure actually if I ever did. But yeah, I mean, I'm not a theist. I think first and foremost, I'm a rationalist, and when you talk about the correspondence or the communication between science and religion, or science and spirituality, like science and religion have got a big problem, and people like Darwin, for example, have sort of had a major impact on people's religiosity. Theories of evolution, things like this. Whereas if you look at the history of the physicists for the 20th century, which I've done, you'll find that almost all of them, of all of the big names, when you're starting with Max Planck, who discovered quantum physics, he was a theist. Werner Heisenberg, who discovered what is called Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. He was a theist. David Bohm, Einstein, despite what the atheists are saying about Einstein, they weren't theists. David Bohm and Einstein weren't theists, but they were what you would probably call panentheists, which is that they see God in all and all in God. In fact, Einstein in particular was quite cagey about his spiritual beliefs, and when asked, he would say things like, I believe in the same God that Spinoza believed in, sort of thing, you know. And in fact, that's what's happened, because religion gave spirituality such a bad name for so long, and especially after the Enlightenment and positivism starting in the middle of the 19th century, where if we didn't have positive evidence for something, then we couldn't accept it. And then, of course, Nietzsche coming along, and Nietzsche didn't actually, like Einstein, who's often held up by the atheists, Nietzsche himself was also not an atheist. And although he was no theist, when Nietzsche said God is dead, he didn't mean all gods are dead. He specifically was he described the Judeo-Christian God specifically, and specifically said that God is dead. And the whole sort of debate, the age of uncertainty, it's often called by historians in the 19th century, the debate about whether we should have science or religion as our moral guide in our lives, either personally or collectively. And, you know, I think the debate is still going on, but religion has suffered a lot of criticism at the morality or lack of morality that religions are guilty of. So I guess in a way, with science, one of the views that I have about, you know, the fact that there's no problem between physics and mysticism. Physics, in fact, is helping mystics understand their experience. And Einstein is, in fact, a classic example of that. And not the only one, David Bohm as well. David Bohm's written books on mysticism and physics and things like that. He's very well known in the New Age movement, with you know, writing about concepts like synchronicity, which is what you're talking about. And, you know, physicists will be able to give you a scientific explanation of synchronicity if you need one. You know, there is one. Carl Jung was also very well known for writing on synchronicity, and he was in touch with David Pauly at the time, who was a great physicist in the middle of the 20th century. So there is no conflict between science and spirituality. There's a huge conflict between science and religion when you want to read the mythology of Adam and Eve, for example, literally, and, you know, take the genealogies out of the Bible, like some Christians do, and say that the universe is only 6,000 years old, or these sorts of things. These types of perspectives have a huge problem once you are confronted with scientific knowledge. But if you want to talk about the mystic aspects of religion or spirituality, you know, and for example, magnetic healing. I mean, magnetic healing has been studied academically for many years. I've got many PDFs and books giving results from clinical experiments of magnetic healing. In other words, you know, laying on of hands and things like this, and understanding processes even as simple as just auto-suggestion or self-hypnosis, and understanding what that's doing to the neurons in the mind, and how prayer can actually change people's lives and things like this, you understand. I mean, now that we understand these different aspects of science, psychology and physics and other sciences, we understand a lot more about spirituality, and I think it's very important for us to do that, to go that way.
Yeah, you know, people, you know, say that, you know, science is only, you know, 200 or 300 years old, and you know, I don't think that's the case. I mean, you know, I mean, it's just changed, and it's just been, you know, I guess it's sort of official now. You know, like science is official now, whereas before it was too sort of contaminated by the maybe the religious sort of influences that we've had, because obviously, you know, religion played a big part in in our ostensibly in civilization, as we can see back throughout the years. I mean, if we look through any ancient civilizations, we see that there is generally a predominant sort of belief system. But these people were scientists too. I mean, and when you were talking about like the scientists that have come, that have had a connection with spirituality, and I think it's probably important to make a bit of a distinction here about science between spirituality and religion. Before religion, there was spirituality. And that's my take on it anyway, is that religion is maybe more of like the institutionalized or the formalized or the structured version of spirituality, and it has been helpful, I think, in some ways, but it has also been, it serves certain interests as well to have a hierarchical structure and maybe place a middleman in there as well, for job security. But Isaac Newton. Sir Isaac Newton, not a lot of people know that he was a mystic. He studied alchemy. I mean, he did a translation of the Emerald Tablets and things like that. But you won't often hear that by the materialists. And one of my first couple of interviews, actually, the guy we were talking about, this chap here, Richard Allen Miller, the author of The Modern Alchemist here, he has a quote when because he studied physics. He was a physicist, biophysicist, anesthesiologist, imaginal psychologist, trained under James Hillman, I think. And he said, "Look, I looked to physics for the answers, and when I didn't find them there, I turned to magic," which is his, I guess, vernacular or thing to say that I found more. Metaphysics has helped me sort of open up a little more to possibility, because the imagination, or the opening up to something greater, like being open to possibility, you can have insights that can, my gosh, how has imagination and spirituality or even religion helped the birth of the rational sciences and things, right? I mean, we were just talking about this. And so they work together, and I mean, they might seem to be at heads and clashing in that, but that's really like, I mean, when we talk about science versus this, it's not like it's almost like maybe the establishment or I'm trying to find the right words for it, but it's maybe the body of science that's mostly available. I mean, when you're talking about energy healing or magnetic healing, I mean, I've done a huge bit of research on that as well, because I wanted to know, and I've found lots of great reviewed studies on that on my one of my websites. Finding that, is because there's a conversation. Oh, geez, I could just go off on so many tangents here, but even the concept of placebo, right? I mean, that's just placebo. This word called placebo is just kind of marginalized, even though it's like, well, hang on. It's just what? It's just a miracle, or it's just like, or not a miracle. It's just
yeah, exactly.
Please,
in
go
New
for
Zealand,
that one,
there's a famous case of a lady called Mary Lamas. I forget. I'm not sure if the first name's correct, but the surname was spelled Lamas. And she was a girl, in fact, like perhaps teenager, 19 or something like that. And she was healed by Ratana. Do you know Wiramu Ratana? The Ratana Church? Yeah?
Yeah, I'm aware of it.
So when he was alive, he was a very well-known faith healer. And she was a cripple, had been in a wheelchair for more than 10 years or something like that. And then he sent her a letter and said to pray to God and she would be healed. And she did that, and she was. And her doctor confirmed this, that this was a miracle. This was like, wow, I've been trying for more than 10 years to heal this girl. She was crippled. She was in a wheelchair. And then Ratner sent a letter to her saying to pray to God and she'll be healed, and that's exactly what happened. And then, of course, all the critics came out and said, oh, well, that's just self-hypnosis, that's just autosuggestion, it's a placebo, which it was, probably, but who cares? Look what it did. It created a miracle. The power of her thinking created her to be healed. It's still a miracle. It doesn't matter if we understand how it worked. Okay, it's not a miracle anymore because we know how it worked. And that's what's happening. That's what, like, there are many, many so-called miracles that we can now explain. And they're not miracles anymore because we understand that they fit into the mechanics of the universe. It's like the interconnected nature of everything. This is how synchronicity works. This is how prayer works. We understand that. When you experience the oceanic feeling, you can feel the interconnectedness of people. You can feel if someone's hostile or believes you. You can feel it. You understand? And this is what the mystics understood thousands of years ago. And in fact, if you look at the garden story in the Bible, for example, or any of these old myths, that's ancient science, because they didn't have the same vocabulary that we have. They didn't have the same rational understanding of everything that we have. And in fact, it is science. If you read the Genesis myth, I don't know, I've got a video, if you've seen the video that I've got that on YouTube, that creation is a blessing. So there's no fall, right? And this is the way that the Jewish people wrote the Genesis myth, and they wrote it to be read in a particular way. And they've never had an original sin or a fall, which the Christians have. That's how they read the text. But they read it in a way completely outside of the context of the way that it was written. Do you understand? The Genesis myth is a very intelligent analogy or metaphor for the evolution of conscious self-awareness. That's why Adam and Eve clothed themselves after they tasted of the so-called tree of good and evil. That's an analogy of the development of conscious self-awareness. And in fact, I sort of have written quite a bit about this, so it's quite detailed, and I don't want to make a big long story about it, but you can actually see that the whole idea of eating of the fruit, God was wrong, and he said on that day you will die, which is not what happened. And the serpent was right. He said on that day your eyes will be open and you will be as gods and you will know good and evil, and that is what happened. And knowing good and evil, this is taken by the Christians as being some sort of, I don't know, curse over us or something like that. But in fact, they forget that before eating the fruit, Adam and Eve didn't know what good was. They didn't learn just evil. They learned good and evil. And of course, this is, to cut a long story short, this is all part of the development of conscious self-awareness. And of course, suffering comes from that, because part of the understanding of conscious self-awareness is that we get closer to the other so that we can have a deeper relationship with another person. When conscious self-awareness implies that we understand we're separate. And when we understand that we're separate, we understand our differences, which is why they clothe themselves through self-awareness and through shame, or how would you say, just self-awareness, the difference. So they understood themselves as different. Therefore, implied in that is they understood the other person as another. Do you understand? So, and that's filling the gap. That's bridging the gap between feeling connected in a more primal sense, like an ant doesn't have the self-awareness that we do, so it's not going to have this existential trauma of feeling alone in the world as much as a human will have. And to bridge that gap, as a compensation for that, we have a better understanding of the other, and we can build deeper relationships with that. That's the good that we understand. The evil, if you want, is ego and shame and guilt and these sorts of things that come through self-awareness. So, that's good science when you understand it, when you read it that way, when you read it the way that it was written to be read, as a metaphor, not as actual two people that lived 6,000 years ago that talked to a talking snake. That was never written to be read like that. It was written to be read as a myth. There's just all symbols that are pointing to a deeper meaning. And it's actually very good science, I think.
Yeah, that was such a great explanation. And I just want to just go back a little bit and just say, look, I remember reading a quote, and I'll paraphrase, from Joan of Arc, who said that, they're only miracles to people who don't understand how they work. And and when you omit, spirituality from the general experience, you start narrowing down how you can view things. And so I'm not surprised that a lot of, we don't know what that. We'll know what the science, the body of science might say. Well, we'll know what it is in 20 years' time once we've found that, that unified theory of everything. And I think, what do you think about the this paradoxical, these paradoxes we keep finding, people trying to reconcile. You've got the body of physics and quantum physics, and some of the stuff works between them, and some of them stuff doesn't. But that's like just one of the many paradoxes that we come across. And there's a quote by Gregory Bateson, what is a metaphor but to serve your paradox? And I find, you know that one?
Yeah. I'm laughing because that's exactly what the point of mythology was. I mean, look, I'm not joking, we've spent the modern era, if you like, most historians sort of started it around Columbus, Copernicus, Martin Luther, sort of 1500 thereabouts, right? That's the modern era, and then Enlightenment come after that on the coattails of Copernicus. Copernicus was the forerunner to Galileo. Funnily enough, we were looking up to the stars for science at the beginning of the modern era. And we've spent the whole modern era trying to rewrite ancient wisdom and stuff. I could give you plenty of examples in psychology, which is my field, if you like, where the 20th century is full of top psychologists, top schools in psychology being taught at university, psychologists are coming trained with beliefs that are completely wrong. For example, I'll give you an example to illustrate what I mean. Throughout its whole life, which is from about the end of the 19th century, psychologists all schools have believed that we are not born with an inherent understanding of ourself. They considered that the baby learnt that over a period of time, months, right? It's by crying to get fed and not being fed straight away, that it understood slowly over a long period of time that it was separate from its mother. Okay, and whole models were built of the development of self-awareness that was considered to take until the child was 4 years old. Okay, 4 years old, the child was fully self-aware. And they would say things like, as long as it's referring to itself in the third person, like, Steve wants some of that ice cream, please. This sort of thing, when they mean I want some, then it's not self-aware. And that's completely rubbish. I actually, to be honest, sort of, I have to confess, I believed that myself for a long time. In fact, it was my daughter who taught me otherwise when she was born. She was born at home, okay? And we had a home birth. And after she had slept her first sleep, she woke up, and I was sleeping next to her. She woke up and she cried. And I just turned and said, "What's the matter?" And she stopped, just like that. Now, she wasn't cold, she wasn't hungry, there was no reason for her to cry, apart from she thought she was alone. Do you understand? And because she thought she was alone, the fact that as soon as she understood that I was there, she had no more stress. She was in stress and she cried because she thought she was alone, and the only thing that happened was that she learned that I was there and she was not alone. And she was happy straight away. She stopped crying and she was happy. Do you understand? And there were many examples that she gave me, which by, days old, because I was obviously very interested in watching our children as they were growing up as a psychologist, because child psychology, developmental psychology, is not very good. It's obvious that the so-called psychologists have never paid any attention to a child growing up, because as soon as you look at your own child, you understand that they are self-aware the moment they're born. And certainly, by a few days old, no one who's ever paid any attention to their own child would think that child is not self-aware. And yet, it was the model in psychology for all psychologists, Freud and Jung included. They all believed that the child developed self-awareness over a long period of time. And it was in the 80s, the 1980s, that eventually an aware person actually stood up and said, "Hey, it's not true. It's not true. The baby isn't learning self-awareness over a long period of time. The baby is aware of itself as an individual, as a separate individual from the moment it's born." And because all of these models have been built up already, and taught, and like how long, it takes 6 months before they can recognize themselves in a mirror and all this sort of thing. Or actually, I think it's supposed to be between 12 and 18 months for that particular example that they can recognize themselves in a mirror. And they were all faulty. They were all faulty. The one about recognizing themselves in a mirror, for example, it's that they have to learn what they look like before they can recognize themselves in a mirror. Do you understand? If they've never seen a mirror, right, when you show them a mirror at 12 months old or 18 months old, they don't know it's them until they learn that that's them. Whereas we showed our daughter in the mirror from the beginning, right? Who, like my oldest child, Indra, is the one that was crying when she first woke up and taught me about that she was self-aware. And we would actually be holding her to the mirror from a few days old. Of course, it does take some time for the eyesight to develop well enough with the baby that they can make out things, and that is something that slows them down to recognize themselves in the mirror. But she understood herself as a separate person in the mirror as soon as she was able to make out the outline in the mirror, the picture in the mirror, well enough with her eyes. You know, many examples that I was given by our children that showed that they were self-aware from the moment they were born. And in fact, what psychologists are talking about when they talk about the awareness of the self is the long development of the ego's identity of how the child wants to project itself in the world, but it's not actually talking about that child being aware of itself as a separate person. And in fact, even before the 80s, when finally the clinical psychologists came out and said, well, we've had a wrong model for the last 100 years, they were actually contradicting themselves by saying things like that a child will see itself as another object. You know, in other words, it sees itself as a separate object from the other objects, but it only sees itself as an object, sort of thing. But I mean, you know, it's still seeing itself as subject object, you know. And the reason that finally they understood that the child was self-aware was because from the moment it's born, it has the ability, the inherent instinctual ability to develop relationships with its caregivers and to, in fact, structure its relationships with its caregivers in a hierarchy. So, in other words, it understands, well, there's mummy. She's number one because that's where my food comes from. Oh, there's my siblings. Okay, they're in the hierarchy. You know, they're sort of next down. You know, or my father, he's the next down, or he's probably below my mother, and then my siblings, because he looks after me a lot more than my siblings do. You know? Then my siblings are there a lot, you know, most of the time. So they're the next one in the hierarchy. And the baby is busy all the time working out who is in their life and how they're going to deal with these people in their relationship. And of course, to have the inbuilt skill to develop relationships and to structure your relationships implies that the baby is self-aware, right? So I've given you this as one example of many. You could write many books giving examples of how modern science for the last 300 or 400 years has in fact had objectively false models of teaching that contradicted. I mean, you go to a lay person and ask them, a mother, any mother, as long as they haven't been trained in psychology, okay? Go to any mother and say, is your child aware that she is separate from you, you know, at a few days or a few weeks or a few months old? And there would be no mother that would say, no, they think they're connected to me. Every mother would say, of course my child knows it's separate from me and it's its own individual. You understand? And that is characteristic of modern science, is that it's just continually built itself on false premises. Sorry to sound very cynical here, but you know, I could give you so many examples where science has gone down a wrong path. Newton is often held up as an example of this, although he wasn't. People talk about the Newtonian paradigm of the separate building blocks and how we know today that, in fact, it's all interconnected. That wasn't Newton who did that. Descartes is, in fact, guilty of that, but not Newton. Newton was, as you said, an alchemist, and the whole idea of gravity, if you understand, you know, the principle, it's just not very difficult to understand the principles of gravity. I mean, we are being held together by invisible energy. So gravity itself is an example of this interconnected nature of the universe, which science tried to undermine with Descartes and the modernists. And then in the 20th century, after Max Planck and quantum physics, and we understood we're going back to the original pre-modern understanding that the world is in fact interconnected, or the universe is in fact interconnected, which helps people understand things like why astrology was so popular, and magic is much more understandable now. Prayer, as I mentioned before, is much more understandable now, because we were building all of our premise, or all of our models, on the premise of, the separate building blocks universe.
Yeah, and wow, yeah, man, you covered quite a bit of territory with that one. That's all good, brother. But this is it, and I just want to go back to this chap that I went to see and listen to, Bruce Lipton, who talks about, he's a bit of a renegade. He used to, lecture at Stanford and Harvard, and the big names, and then he made a discovery that got him kicked out of the club because he sort of went against the grain. And basically, what he's saying is that the hypothesis that we're predisposed to hereditary illnesses, based on our genes, is completely incorrect. And that what happened is that theory, or that hypothesis, got left in the book, and it never sort of got further examined, and it just stayed in there. And so the whole premise, and so what you said is exactly right. We've built a lot of our foundations and institutions, a lot of our institutions and understandings based upon, things that are incorrect, but
yeah, that's right.
But we can't exclude the reality that there were large interests that wanted to sort of create, steer understanding a certain way because it benefited them. And yeah,
that's an important point. Sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted, before we got sort of distracted, that's an important point, is these large interests, because in fact, if we have the separate building blocks model of the universe and of the environment, then industrial capitalism, industrial technology, and capitalism and consumerism and all of these things works, right? And of course, why doesn't global economics work? Why isn't industrial technology working for us? It might be working to provide us the consumer trinkets that we end up with, but it's not working insofar as a sustainable way to develop forward for our culture. And hopefully, I think people are learning that now, that industrial technology is not going to all of a sudden have the snake oil of the right catalytic converter for the exhausts for our cars, and then all of a sudden everything's going to be all right, and that is one of the main thrusts of the reason why it's dying so hard, because the whole, these false models that science are built on, is because the whole modern era is built on these false models. The false model of, the separate building blocks universe, right? That's not interconnected, right? That false model. That is what drives global economics. That is what drives the whole setup of the modern era, right? And to understand that, in fact, the universe is interconnected, and we can't keep taking all of the oil out of the ground and all of the other minerals and things. We can't keep polluting the atmosphere and the water and the land and all of this. I mean, if we really were serious about that, which hasn't happened yet, if we were serious about that, we would stop industrial technology completely, right? Which would, of course, destroy the global economy, absolutely just destroy it. Because no one wants to give up all of the trinkets that have been given to us from accepting this paradigm of industrial technology. We want our computers, we want our cars, we want all of these things. We think even that it's our right to have these things. And so we will carry on with the modern era. We will carry on with industrial technology until such point as it's taken away. And there's no way that we can carry on, and that's the inevitable conclusion of the trajectory or the train line that we're on, is that we will just keep depleting the soils. We would keep polluting by, with our industrial technology, our built on the false premise of the separate building blocks, until, we get to the point where the earth as a self-regulating organism will just stop us, which is happening anyway. People saying that coronavirus is part of that, and certainly there are other natural disasters and things like that. I mean, this is all part of the truth of the interconnected nature, is that if we carry on being a parasite, sucking the blood from the earth, then the earth will heal itself from us. And that's the truth of the real paradigm. And that's going to come hard to humans, It's going to come hard to our culture as it exists.
And to quote a wise man, in a sense, who wasn't so wise in his actions, but he certainly dropped some good wisdom, and that was Lemmy Kilmister, when he said, don't worry about the planet. She's got volcanoes and tsunamis and earthquakes and shit. When she's tired of us, she'll just flick us off. And so here's the thing: things want to grow. There is a natural devolution, an involutionary cycle to things, the death, the process. So this is all part of the life process. But if we're imposing more of the death process on it, so to speak, to try and get some kind of personal gain or, whatever, I mean, we're either a good cell or a bad cell, so to speak. And what does the body do? I mean, if we think about it in a micro sense, or as above, so below, or the fractal version of ourselves, what are we doing? What are our choices doing? What are we participating in when we make choices throughout the day? Are we helping things, or are we, buying the stupid over packaged nonsense? It's like, even that concept of packaging, like, the packaging industry is bigger than the actual product, in most senses. It comes in, you unwrap it, and then you've got the little thing in your hand, and you've got all this mountain of packaging, and then you just biff it, and it's because it's about appealing and getting you to keep wanting things. I mean, before I had my awakening, I was right into gadgets. I was always wanting to get the latest Apple this and the latest this and that, and I got everything I wanted, and then all of a sudden I was like, this is not satisfying anymore. I can't, I'm just jumping from stimulus to stimulus. And when I went on the inner journey and started meditating and researching things, that's when I started feeling fulfilled in my life, was knowledge and understanding, and then finding ways to apply that, and which is the wisdom aspect of it, in my view, which is the applied application of knowledge. And I started feeling satiated, in a sense, or that I was actually heading towards fulfillment, and it wasn't through these external things. It was just like, man, I've been living from the outside in, and this is where I found, just on a quick side note, is that with my research into the conversation of Reiki, it's very different to what the original concept was. People talk about bringing down the light, or like pulling it in through the crown and that. Well, the original conversation of Reiki is that, first of all, it's your inner light. Basically, you start off life with a light, and then you pretty much shroud it. You enshroud it, and then I get to the point in my life where I'm like going, there must be more. And then through learning, I start removing the shrouds and start realizing that the power was inside me the whole time. The divine spark was in me. It's not something I have to bring in. It was already here. But on the flip side, there's the conversation about, creating a temple worth of spirit to indwell. And so, you kind of, I'm wrestling with these concepts, but, by using all these sort of different ideas, it helps me to form a responsible way of living that I have to figure out myself. And yeah. Sorry, go.
Yeah, it's all very interesting. I guess in a way, to talk about alchemy. In alchemy, there's the concept of the world soul, and this is, or the anima mundi, and the world soul is exactly that point. It's just the whole fact of the interconnected nature and that light energy, if you like, that is coursing through the whole universe. Yeah. So I think that people are waking up to the idea that, in fact, these material possessions that we're being tempted with and rewarded with for our loyalty to the system, to the modern Western industrial social experiment that we're living in now, it's not worth it. We're losing our souls, and every psychologist worth the name has said for the last 100 years that we are living in a soulless society, and the idea is, well, how do we get to our soul, and I don't think
That's
that the material gimmicks and trinkets that they're giving us, offering us in the modern era, I don't think that that's at all the way that we're designed to nurture our soul. For me, if you want to talk about spirituality and a way, um, you know, a teaching, if you like, the first step should be get back to nature, have a garden, live in the wild, get out of the city. And these are very important things. And in fact, now through neurology and psychology, we understand that that's the truth. Dirt, for example, has healing organisms in it and microbes, and it has chemicals in it that actually produce us, chemicals in our brain that make us happy. This is from dirt. We know that being in nature or being at the beach and things like that actually have a positive effect on our brain. So now we understand that, in fact, this sort of, it's not rhetoric. This whole idea of get back to nature is, in fact, what we are born to be. And if you want to understand your soul, if you want to live a spiritual life, then you should be getting to the original person that you were born to be, and not this programmed kind of artificial person that the state, the governments are turning us into. The multinationals are trying, with all the media and saturated with brainwashing, to turn us into something unnatural, inauthentic.
Hey, yeah, perfect. And I was going to say we're just about to reach the hour, but I'm more than happy to go
Oh,
on
okay.
for say another half an hour if you want to carry on for a bit because this is so good. I mean, how are you placed for time?
Are you able to carry on for
Oh
half
yeah,
an hour?
yeah,
Oh,
man,
okay.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that's
All right. Yeah. No, that's fine. Yeah.
cool. Because you're right. I mean, we're kind of at a crossroads now. Well, at a fork in the road, I should say, where we've got, and I'd even say there's always a middle path, right? We've got an encouragement to go down the sort of augmented transhumanist technocratic sort of trajectory where people are wanting to get things put in them and improve their life through technology and a way that kind of counters the other direction, which is when you go say maybe sort of hardcore towards I mean, I've seen some things that I can't explain. I mean, some of the Reiki work or the energy healing work that I've done doesn't match up with the rational sort of understanding that's generally peddled through the mainstream, but there's capabilities within us that we're not exploring. I mean, dream work, astral projection. Oh my God, and we've got phenomena in the sky. The government's just come out in the last few weeks and said, yeah, those videos of those things in the sky, we don't know what they are. Now, regardless of the veracity of the videos, they're publicly coming out and saying we don't know what they are. And so the timing of these things. But anyway, like I said, this opportunity of some people are going to go, you know what, I want to download my consciousness into the cloud. And it's like, bro, your consciousness is already in the cloud. Like I've got a quote that I love to share that I think I came up with myself, but I'm not going to own anything really. I mean, but it's like, show me where God is not. When people talk about, you've got to go, you can't connect, you've got to go through this person to talk to God. And I'm like, well, hang on, aren't I made him? I mean, isn't he omnipotent and all this sort of thing? And I'm like going, technology as a sense is the same for me, but it's like it's not the technology itself, it's our relationship to it. And are we using it as a tool to enhance our lives, to get us back to creating the garden that this planet could be, or are we allowing it to sort of just like I said, we're talking about this, about it's almost like become a distraction from the great work, you know. And yeah, I mean, sorry, I've covered a bit of stuff there, but I don't know if you've got some comments on, you know,
Yeah,
sort of
no, I mean, I followed everything that you're saying, and you raised some good points. You didn't, as far as I could see, you sort of didn't really give your sort of end answer to it. But the important points are, you know, are we going to keep going on this trajectory we have at the moment where, you know, technology is considered to be our salvation? This is positivism. This is 19th century sort of what people call scientific materialism, where they thought positive information, positive evidence, and then we can have a better understanding, better knowledge of the world, and then we can use that to create a better world. And this was very much, and of course technology was all part of that, because technology brought medicine and other, you know, hospitals and, you know, other you know, X-ray machines and all this sort of thing. So of course technology was lauded as being part of this. The 20th century was a big slap in the face for the positivists, starting off with the Titanic. The reason the Titanic looms so large now popular consciousness is not because 1,500 people died. It's because it was named after the gods, right? It was at the high point of the positive movement, if you like, the positive philosophy. It was supposed to be the unsinkable ship that sunk on its maiden voyage. Now, I know there's a whole lot of controversy, I mean, you know, conspiracy theories around it, which may or, you know, may or may not actually be the case. The point is the symbol of the Titanic that sunk on its first maiden, you know, voyage. Then there was the First World War. By the end of the First World War, no intelligent person was saying that science and technology is going to lead us into a better future. The people that are still holding this idea really, I just can't understand that anyone could believe that, because if science and technology, or, you know, if industrial technology is going to do anything, it's going to destroy us. And I think that's the lesson we learned in the First World War. The Second World War only underlined that same lesson. And when you're talking about these, you know, Reiki and these other forms of magnetic healing and stuff like that, we haven't even begun to look at alternative healing practices like these things. I personally am into learning about various healing plants like aloe. We have a collection of about 25 different aloes. In Germany, we call them aloes. The genus is called aloes, you know, so I sort of almost said aloe. So if I start talking, you know, giving German pronunciations, you'll understand why. But calanchoes as well, we have a variety of these. And in fact, I've been doing quite a bit of research, and a lot of the information and knowledge about these plants has been lost because we have ignored them. In fact, they've almost become illegal. I think it was in 2007 in New Zealand, there was a law passed that alternative medicines were not allowed. You know, I think you can still get away with saying you can use this for that and this, but you can't say it's medicine, which, you know, I guess is fair enough as long as it's available. I don't know how far that law went. But the thing is, the point is that I have had this discussion with people many times. Usually they say I'm the first person they've ever heard say this. But in fact, there is not one thing that anyone has ever shown me that is a positive, worthwhile aspect of industrial technology worth keeping. And in fact, usually people say modern medicine, which in fact, if you understand about modern medicine and the people who are controlling it, modern medicine, the pharmaceutical business, which is exactly what it is. It's an industry, it's a business, and it has quite literally murdered, deliberately, willfully murdered far more people than it's ever helped. And even with what's so-called helping the pharmaceutical industry has done is very debatable whether it's been helping at all. And that's just in the direct use of pharmaceuticals. That's not including all of the testing on animals and the destruction to the environment that's going on with pharmaceutical companies. who are all actually, as it happens, tied very, very intimately to oil companies. One example is Dulux Paints, who, when you look, beyond the surface of who owns Dulux, and then I can't remember I used to be a painting contractor too. I could have told you 20 years ago who owns Dulux, and then who owns that company and who owns that company. But it's just, a few families own the whole thing, and they are literally controlling the medical profession, these individual people. In psychology, when you go to a university in the West and you learn psychology, you will be lectured to by sales reps from pharmaceutical firms, right? They will have lectures on psychopharmacology where someone who is a chemist, perhaps, so they will have some sort of qualification, and they will come to your university from the pharmaceutical company, right, where they are working, and they will lecture you and teach you about their pharmaceuticals. And I mean, this is a huge subject, but for me, there's no middle ground. I'm a Tolkienist. J.R.R. Tolkien was very, very big on this theme as well, and you can see it in his books. There is nothing good about industrial technology, and there is so much bad that we must abandon it. We must. And there is no middle ground. There is no, we'll get the right catalytic converter for our cars. I remember talking to a Greenpeace sales rep one day in Sydney. And, I said, well, we shouldn't have cars. And she said, oh, no, it's all right. The carbon monoxide's not a worry if we're running them on methane or clean burning fuels, or we get the right catalytic converter. And I said, yeah, but what about manufacturing the car itself? And what about the roads? Roads themselves are polluting. They also are cutting through the environment. You know what I mean? And she couldn't understand it. This was a sales rep for Greenpeace, and she'd never heard anything as radical as that before. That we shouldn't have cars. She was shocked. She was shocked. I'd say that would be just the start. Getting rid of cars completely. I mean, totally. That's just the start. And it will come to that we have no choice eventually.
Wow, man, that's a very powerful drop you put there. And could I just get you to drop your volume down on the speakers a bit? It's feeding back.
Yeah, I have to find that. Sorry, I'm probably going.
No, that's right. It's not your input volume; it's your speaker volume.
How I've got to find that button again that we found.
Oh, not the one we were talking. Oh, just your speaker volume.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, it's coming in back and through the mic input. Yeah.
I got your feedback. Are we having a bit of feedback?
Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, that's better. Thank you. So yeah, no. Hey, man, look, I'm wrestling with this, and I absolutely hear you. I mean, we wouldn't need and to whatever extent, if people were living with eating better and exercising more and living life more fully and getting back to nature more, I mean, we wouldn't have this so-called need for all of these sort of industrial type like cures and things like that. This, like, you've got this, I mean, I've been and spoken to principals who say the ages of the kids there's more kids going on medication in the schools, and the ages of those kids is decreasing when they go onto these medications. And so what we're seeing is that we're seeing this increasingly medicated populace, and it's like going, why is this happening? It's like, well, it's just evolution. So I was like, I don't buy any of that shit, man. Like, it's like people are just not informed, or they're not taking the steps. And I think one of the outcomes of the situation that we're currently enjoying globally is that people are starting to question, how are they, what's their relationship with their immune system? I mean, when I see people getting up, when I see commentators getting up, and they're people who are saying, what we should do in that, and they don't look very healthy, and I'm like going, these are the people, they might be overweight for whatever reason.
I've seen those photos.
They're gaunt, and and then there's that Dr. Hotez, who's a vaccine, an outspoken vaccine man, who gets all the prime time airtime on the various news networks. And, you know, Joe Rogan interviewed him, and Joe started talking to this guy and saying, because they were talking as mates about, you know, how this doctor has a very unhealthy relationship with fast food. And I'm like going, can people not pick up on this? Like I live well. Like I eat a plant-based diet. I have done for about 6 years. I'm in great health. People know me before. I'm a great before and after case because I'm in, you know, I was a fat white pasty blob and now I'm in great shape. And I'm like going, well, this makes more sense to me to live better, and then I don't need these things, and then I'm not, you know, and then hopefully I'm the living, you know, I'd like to think I'm a living example of, you know, how, you know, bit of meditation, bit of exercise, and all these things that my relationship started improving. You know, my whole life started improving. It improved every aspect when I started looking at the primary needs of my human existence. As opposed to, oh, shiny, oh, you know, oh, that looks cool, oh, I want that because then that'll make me look more attractive to the opposite sex or something like this. And I'm not insulted or anything. I've got a better understanding, but I have to laugh now when I see people who are commentators, you know, saying, you know, you should do this and you should do that. And it's like going, well, you're not really the, you know, the demonstrator model of the prime candidate for what I can be aiming for. You know, if anything, you know, yeah. Anyway,
Well, funny you should say that, but I agree with you totally. I mean, I'm not the only, you know, we are not the only people saying this. I mean, the lifestyles that people are leading are terrible. Apart from the fact that every disease, every natural disease, okay, that there is, will have a natural remedy, you know, and I mean, it's an indictment on our culture that we have forgotten so much of the knowledge about aloes and calanchoes and even lavender and other, you know, I mean, we've got a raft of different things. And I'm looking at these academic tests and journals and things like this, where they are admitting that there is these potential and this and that chemical in these plants, and we haven't got anywhere near into the depth of understanding what potential healing could be in that plant, you know. It's just a disgrace that this has happened to our culture, that we have lost so much information. And then people will say, oh yeah, but we've been able to synthesize these pills, which largely were built on you know, plants anyway, chemicals that have come from plants anyway, originally, you know. I mean, this is, again, back to alchemy. This is what the alchemists, you know, this is why you had the witches, you know, this huge witch craze and the witch hunts and things like that. One of the reasons, one of the main reasons, was because you had herbalists and midwives who were competing with the new doctor profession that was burgeoning at the time. And so, I mean, there were other reasons as well, but certainly the victims were pinpointed because they were competing with the status quo doctors who had all the power, you know, and things haven't changed. You know, things haven't changed.
well, you know, and that's a great look. We'll start, you know, we'll start heading towards the wrapping things up, but
Yeah.
but what I wanted to say is that, you know, this comes back to the original, you know, this alchemical process, and like literally, like you know, when you're not finding the answers out there, right? You start this personal process, and then you've got to clear your mind. You've got to be able to think clearly and learn how to think, not, you know, not necessarily what to think, through the you know, through knowledge, and then developed into understanding, and then applied through the wisdom, you know, or wisdom, sorry, the application of that knowledge. But, you know, how can, I mean, we're looking for ways to get ourselves right inside, to get ourselves aligned, so, you know, we're not in internal conflict. You know, I say this but I do that. I mean, that's just a cause of suffering in my experience. But how can we live the truly authentic life? Well, we've got to get back to that we've got to boil everything down and separate it down to that prima materia, in a sense, and then kind of go from there. And so this is kind of what I see when I read your work, is that, you know, we have a responsibility to take on this great work, because we all have a part to play in getting things back to the garden that it could be. And it's, you know, it's probably going to take some time if we don't, if we don't piss off the Great Mother enough. We can. I think we've still got a chance. I'd like to think so. I am an optimist. I'm not sure things, but I think that these processes, these mystical approaches, this mythological approach, these metaphorical approaches are very like you said, the layman doesn't really know a lot of this stuff. And so I just want to say too, I'm sorry I jump around a bit, but the way that you the way the artwork and the way that you've presented the Spiritual Alchemy book is very aesthetically enjoyable, and so and I think that's a real key, because when I quit my corporate job to be a muso and a teacher in that, like, I did it because it was cool, it was interesting, and it stimulated me, and it brought me out of my because I was heading down the path of becoming a sociopath in a sense, and I really was. I was very ambitious, very cocky, and all that sort of thing. But when I went into teaching and working with kids and things like that, it helped me bring out the inner child, and it really started to bring out a real sense of what joy was. And then I naturally found myself gravitating towards more sort of, healthier, or what I would consider healthier sort of options for living. Although, to be fair, in the early stages before I got burnt out of it, I was certainly, drinking, smoking, and enjoying other sorts of various things as a way of coping with because it was quite a stressful job too. I had a very high public profile. But, this people who are looking for ways to improve their life, I think this is an extremely valuable option for those who may be feeling a bit disenchanted with what's currently on the table as far as what's most visible. And so, Steve, if you could just talk about how searching and developing ourselves from the inside out is this. Well, I don't know. This is just my opinion anyway. I think this is the only way we're going to get this done. Is we have to sort ourselves out first before we can even attempt to start changing the world. Or is it that the working on our insides? In my view, when I was trying to control the outer world and not seeing any results, I started changing my inner world, and then I started watching the world change. I found it to be a much more successful approach to seeing my relationships improved, and also my relationship with myself and with the world.
Sure. I mean, obviously, alchemy is, I qualify the alchemy that I'm writing, practicing myself and writing about. I qualify that as spiritual alchemy. And although there are a lot of, and with herbs and things like this, you get to the point where you're doing a lot of tinctures and making, different medicines and stuff. So you're talking about making the physical alchemy as well. But the alchemy that I've been mostly busy with, as far as my writing goes, is to do with inner psychological processes and inner healing. And of course, naturally, that's going to affect, your position in the world, and then the world as it comes to you is going to be affected by your own, because our own personal universe is a reflection of what's going on inside us. And when I say our own personal universe, I mean, what's happening in our own personal day-to-day life with our relationships and things like that. I don't mean that, the Jews caused the Holocaust because they had the wrong sort of thinking. So therefore, we have to sort of balance this out with the fact that, other people are on their journeys as well, So we can't say that the whole universe outside us is just a reflection of in us, but our own personal universe, our relationships with our immediate people and things like this are a reflection of inside us. And to make our universe, our personal world better is the first step along the way to make, it's like a drop in the pool. We can make the ripples go further and further as we are treating our children with love and patience and kindness. Then they are treating their friends who, will treat their friends and things like this, and it just moves on like that. I am not an optimist in the immediate direction of what the world is where we're going. I am apocalyptimist, which means that, it's obviously going to all collapse. There is nothing more certain than the modern culture will collapse. Nothing is more certain than that. It's just a question of when. I do, however, believe that there will be a phoenix that rises from the ashes of that collapse. And that's what I am busy preparing my children, teaching my children. I mean, I'm teaching my children to do things like build from demolition materials so that they can, make a house from the rubble. And I'm very serious about that. They have learnt about regenerating dead soils and things like that. I mean, they range in age from 3 to 10. And I would say that by the time that they're teenagers, oh, sorry, the oldest is 8, 9, coming up 10. Yeah, okay. So by the time they're teenagers, they will be pretty adept at looking after themselves in any situation, you know. And that for
Yeah,
me,
and
that's the future. That's what everyone wants to do something for the future, with the future, if you like. That's my work for the future, is teaching my children to survive I mean, anyone that can't see this coming is blind. It's coming, and it's actually getting faster every day.
well, I got to say, the amount of money that's being printed off to sort of buff up, the situation that's been imposed upon us it can only go one way. You can only print so much money off, and then you're going to, it costs you $1 million to buy a loaf of bread. So,
Yeah. Well, that's
you
going to
know,
happen too.
that right. So, you're absolutely right. And I really like, you're introducing me to some new terms and things, and I'm so grateful, brother, because I feel so much more
You're most
enlightened.
welcome.
And thank you. This has been such a wonderful conversation. And you're right. And one of I just want to bring this guy up again, because the other thing he talks about is he talks about he also does urban survival stuff, because can you live off the grid for 30 days? What do you do? And what's the most important tool in your toolkit? The conversation of your attitude is even more important than your Swiss Army knife, so to speak, because that's the difference about being able to get through it or not. And have you got the skills? I mean, you know what? I've started growing a garden, and sure, it's a little thing, and I've it's probably suffered at the hands of my ignorance, but I'm developing an understanding, and I have to push myself to get down on my knees and pull the weeds out. But once I get that process going, it's so satisfying to know that I can go down and I might have a capsicum that I can use to feed myself, or pull the spinach out.
Exactly.
And suddenly I reduce the importance of money in my life. I don't need to work so long and earn so much. I'm actually becoming more connected with the earth, and the earth is providing. The shit literally grows out of the freaking ground, right? You don't,
Yeah.
it's being given to us, and yet, like you said, there are people who don't know me, or people that have large interests that are trying to impose these draconian sort of imperatives upon us to separate us from our connection with the plants. And obviously the cannabis conversation is huge at the moment here in New Zealand, because I've got a mate who got he got given up by the establishment, told to get his affairs in orders. He was riddled with cancers. Someone showed up, gave him some cannabis oil, and 3 months later, all of a sudden, they're all gone. And it's like, wow, isn't that interesting? And this thing is like, the food affects our mood and affects our attitude and these things too. So it is a thing. The internal process is most definitely helped by the physical process, and this relationship to the plants. We don't have to just. I think what it is too is that you can't patent a plant, but the synthesis or the extracts and the synthetic conversation can be. And so the people talk about just pull this part out of the plant, but it's like, well, actually the plant wants to give you the whole thing. Now the herbalists know that sometimes you have to mix this plant and this plant, and I'm finding myself being more interested in what you're talking about in regards to the herbal remedy kind of thing, because nature's got everything. I mean, everything that we need, but have we got the courage, and have we got the courage, and have we got the drive to actually seek this out, or are we waiting to be spoon-fed or handed the solutions from the authority that is the reigning thoroughly that we enjoy at the time. So
well, they're all very important points. So
yeah. And so I just want to say we've got about 5 minutes left, and I thought what I'd do is that in these closing minutes, I would get your give you the floor to just closing thoughts, and also absolutely do a shameless plug on your available information so that people know where to go. So just you go for it, brother.
Okay, well, thanks again, Phil. Yeah, I mean, my shameless plug is just that you can find me on spiritualinstinctpress.com. This year, I've been writing full time for the last 3 years, and this year I'm actually going through my whole catalog and publishing new editions for each of my books. I've started with the manual that Phil was talking about, which is going to be published this week as a Kindle book, and it's available on my website as a print copy. And each month, we're in May now, each month this year there will be a new book. The next book is my book, The Occult History of the Toad, which has a lot of alchemy about the toad in it. A lot of occult information, which includes the toad's position as a symbol and ingredient in alchemy. Then the next book after that will be my book, The Idea of the Archetype, which is a very in-depth and quite comprehensive book on the history and function of the archetype, which goes a lot further, a lot broader than the Jungian idea of the archetype. There are many other psychologists in the 20th century that wrote of the archetype, not always using that name. Sometimes imago, they would use the term imago. There are also a lot of mystics and occultists over the centuries who talked about the archetype. So I draw on many different ideas of the archetype, not just the Jungian ideas. Not that I disagree so strongly with Jung, but I think it's important to balance our understanding of the archetype beyond the corpus of Jung. Yeah, so those are to look forward to. And again, just one more time, I think it's been actually going along the bottom anyway. Spiritualinstinctpress.com. That's the best way to keep in touch. There's a contact page there. And thanks again, Phil.
Hey, you're very welcome. And, this is if people are looking back through the catalogue of the interviews that I've done over the last sort of month, they'll notice that there is they seem quite disparate in a sense that they don't seem all that connected, but there is an underlying thread here. In a sense, I'm trying to figure out what the heck's going on and how I can improve myself and how I can serve my brothers and sisters better through sharing knowledge and things like that. And, this conversation we're having here is so important, and you addressed it in the book. I actually tried to show the cover on my iPad, but for some reason I
wondered what was happening.
I was trying to show a picture of the cover of the book. I might just pull it up and see if I can share it, actually.
I haven't even got one up here with me.
Hang on, I'll see if I can find it, and I'll do a screen share. Where are we? Spiritual Alchemy. Oh crap, it's not coming up, but that's okay. Oh, here we go. Oh crap. Okay, what I'll do is that I might just take a screenshot and I'll add it to the comments there so people can see it, because it's very cool. But like I said, this idea that what's available to us through the mainstream or the most visible sort of spiritual sort of institutions, and that some people they go there. I found that I went there and I didn't find it to be something that really that didn't answer enough questions or didn't lead me to enough, broader understanding. And I think that this concept of alchemy and the overall greater search for meaning and purpose and connection. I'm just rapping on words that I think are associated here, a greater sense of connectedness with others and to our immediate environment and to the people around us, can be found by casting a broad net and not being locked into sort of like, this one book is all you need. It's like, man, I tried that. It didn't work for me. And I found Steve's, but prior to the this conversation we're having now, we did a bit of off-air chat and we were talking about, your where you came from, with Christianity, and that led you into, where you are now. So, I mean, we've still got a couple of minutes here. If you could just, sorry, I did start another thread of conversation, but I don't know if you could just give a quick encapsulation just to cover that. Like I said, people aren't finding what they're looking for and what's generally available.
Yeah, I think at the moment, really, it's like a smorgasbord, in fact. And it's very much like the first century, in the days when Jesus was around, where you could sort of, have a bit of magic over here and a bit of astrology over there and go to a palmist tomorrow. And I think there's a bit of a smorgasbord of spiritual belief at the moment, which is good and bad, because it means that people have a huge choice, but very often there's not a system. There's not a complete system, and I think people are getting lost because of that. And that's another reason why I'm very keen personally on alchemy, and I have focused specifically in my writing on alchemy, because it gives a complete system. It takes you from start to finish. It's got all of the bases covered in the middle, and there's nothing that isn't covered, if you like. I was trying to think of a better word than covered, but yeah, I mean, and I guess in a way, all of the other things, astrology is very closely tied to alchemy, and the idea of chakras and kundalini comes very much into alchemy. So it's Kabbalism comes into alchemy, and you'll actually see that all of these things overlap anyway. And so alchemy for me was just something where I could just learn about all of these different aspects and have a complete system, a package, if you like, that was also, it's the alchemy that I am pursuing, the Hermetic tradition, is Western, which suits the fact that I had already started on, Phil was saying about Christianity. I'd started on Christianity. I had a good working knowledge of Christianity by the time that I went to university, which I do everything a lot later. I didn't have children till I was 50, and I didn't go to university till I was 30, this sort of thing, So by the time that I started at university, I had already been involved with the church and learned a lot about the Western tradition. So it was natural for me to continue academically with the Western tradition.
Perfect. And what a great place to call an end to this wonderful conversation, this wonderful meeting. And I hope that everyone out there has enjoyed this. Remember to go and check out Steve's website. It's scrolling along the bottom and has been now. It should be well impressed upon the back of your head, so that you'll wake up in the morning and go, why do I want to go to this website? Well, it should be a highlight for you if you go and check it out, because it's very, very rich in information. So, Steve, thank you once again for being on the show. Much araha to you, brother, and please keep doing what you're doing. And we'll see what's happening in the next couple of months, and we'll maybe have another catch up and talk some more, and see what else is going on. So,
great. All right.
Thank you so much.
Well, have a great week, and thanks a lot.
You're very welcome. All right, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Enjoy the show. I'll post it up on YouTube shortly, and have a great day. See you then. Bye-bye.
Bye.